In the early hours of a carefully chosen morning, a convoy moved through the streets of Caracas with precision that could only come from months of invisible preparation. The world would see the capture of Nicolas Maduro as a sudden strike, a bold military maneuver, executed by U.S. Special Forces operating under authority granted by international warrants and political pressure. But what the cameras didn't capture, what the headlines couldn't explain, was the shadow architecture that made it all possible. Behind every successful operation targeting a head of state lies an intelligence apparatus so deeply embedded, so meticulously constructed, that its very existence remains classified long after the mission ends. This is the story of an invisible foundation, the patient work of analysts and field operatives who spent years in the dark, so that one operation could unfold in the light. The geopolitical groundwork for Maduro's capture didn't begin weeks before the operation. It began years earlier, as Venezuela descended into economic collapse, mass migration, and authoritarian consolidation. The United States, along with dozens of nations, had ceased to recognize Maduro's legitimacy after disputed elections and constitutional violations. Sanctions intensified, diplomatic channels froze, and within the classified corridors of Langley, authorization was quietly granted for covert operations inside Venezuela, operations designed not to overthrow, but to observe, to map, to understand. The objective was intelligence supremacy, to know Maduro's world so completely that if the moment ever came to act, there would be no hesitation, no miscalculation. The Central Intelligence Agency understood what military planners have always known, that you cannot capture what you cannot find, and you cannot find what you do not understand. How do you locate a head of state who rarely travels without layers of security, who shifts residences unpredictably, who trusts almost no one? The answer lies in patience and penetration. According to sources familiar with the operation, a small CIA team had been operating inside Venezuela for months before the capture, embedded within the capital and possibly beyond. These weren't paramilitary operators staging sabotage. They were intelligence officers conducting the most delicate and dangerous work the agency undertakes, building a human network. The team's mission was singular in focus but vast in scope. They needed to track Maduro's daily routines, his patterns of movement, his vulnerabilities. They needed to know where he slept, where he worked, who he trusted, and when he was most exposed. This wasn't surveillance in the traditional sense. It was the construction of a living intelligence portrait, updated in real time, refined through layered sources, and cross-verified until every detail could be relied upon, the most critical asset in any intelligence operation targeting a protected individual is not technology. It is human access, and here, the CIA's most sensitive work unfolded. Multiple reports suggest that the agency successfully cultivated sources within Maduro's inner circle, individuals with proximity to his movements and decision-making. These were not ideological recruits necessarily, but people vulnerable to leverage, whether financial desperation, personal grievance, or the simple erosion of loyalty that comes with prolonged isolation and paranoia. The agency has long specialized in this kind of recruitment, identifying individuals who possess both access and motive, then carefully nurturing those relationships until intelligence begins to flow. In Maduro's case, the intelligence was granular, real-time updates on his location, advance, notice of schedule changes, details about security protocols and the composition of his protective detail. This wasn't guesswork. It was direct reporting from individuals who had every reason to know. But human intelligence alone, no matter how precise, requires validation. The CIA reportedly deployed aerial surveillance assets over Venezuelan airspace. Missions conducted with such secrecy that even allied governments may not have been fully briefed. These weren't the lumbering reconnaissance aircraft of Cold War imagery. They were advanced drones, possibly launched from naval platforms or covert airstrips, equipped with sensors capable of tracking heat signatures, communications, and movement patterns across dense urban terrain. The drones fed data into analytical models that cross-referenced human reports with electronic intercepts and geospatial intelligence. The goal was to eliminate uncertainty, to know, beyond operational doubt, where Maduro would be at a given moment and what obstacles would stand in the way of reaching him. This synthesis of human and technical intelligence, the merging of clandestine reporting with technological omniscience, represents the apex of modern intelligence craft. The psychological dimension of this operation cannot be understated. For the officers running this operation, the stakes were immense. Discovery would mean the exposure of sources, the collapse of years of work, and possibly the execution of those who had risked everything to cooperate. Every meeting, every communication, every surveillance pass carried the potential for catastrophic failure. The officers involved operated undercover identities, moving through a hostile environment where the state security apparatus, though degraded by economic crisis, remained ruthless. They knew that Maduro's intelligence services, trained by Cuban and Russian advisors, were actively hunting for foreign operatives. The margin for error was non-existent, and yet they persisted, because intelligence work at this level demands a tolerance for uncertainty and danger that few can sustain. As the operation neared its culmination, the intelligence picture grew sharper. The CIA team had delivered what military planners call actionable intelligence, a complete operational package that included not just Maduro's location, but the security conditions, the timing windows, and the contingencies. When U.S. Special Forces moved, they did so with a level of confidence that only comes from intelligence saturation. They knew the route, they knew the guards, they knew the layout, and when the operation concluded successfully, the public narrative focused on the boldness of the raid, the skill of the operators, the geopolitical ramifications. But within the intelligence community, there was a quieter understanding. Without the months of invisible groundwork, without the patient cultivation of sources, without the technical surveillance that verified every human report, the capture would have been impossible. The operation succeeded not because of the final act, but because of everything that came before it. The architecture of secrecy that no one saw and few will ever fully know. What follows now is the harder work of understanding how the architecture was actually constructed, piece by piece, in an environment where almost nothing could be taken at face value. Much of what intelligence analysts believe occurred is derived from fragmented reports, post-operation leaks, and the logic of tradecraft itself, rather than official confirmation. Intelligence work leaves few records and even fewer witnesses, but patterns emerge, and from those patterns, a picture of methodology begins to form. The challenge in targeting any head of state, particularly one governing through authoritarian control, is not merely gathering information, but validating it. Leaders like Maduro live inside fortified routines designed to obscure rather than reveal. Their movements are compartmentalized, their schedules known only to a handful of trusted aides, and even those aides operate under surveillance from internal security forces tasked with detecting betrayal. How do you confirm a leader's location when every movement is designed to mislead? How do you build certainty from a system engineered to produce deception? The answer lies in constructing a targeting picture from multiple, independent streams of intelligence, each one incomplete on its own, but collectively capable of producing reliable patterns. Human intelligence forms the foundation. In authoritarian regimes, loyalty is a performance, sustained by fear as much as conviction. The CIA's ability to penetrate Maduro's inner circle likely depended on identifying individuals whose loyalty had eroded, people who had witnessed corruption, personal slights, or threats to their own survival, and who saw cooperation not as betrayal, but as self-preservation. These sources are rarely ideological. They are opportunistic, coerced, or desperate. Some may have been family members of detained dissidents, offered leverage in exchange for information. Others could have been military officers sidelined in purges, or administrative staff with access to schedules and communications but no personal stake. In the regime's survival, the agency's recruitment methods are patient and indirect. Contact is established through intermediaries. Trust is built slowly. Information is tested against known facts to establish reliability. And over time, a source becomes productive, delivering not just single data points but sustained reporting. That begins to map the contours of a protected life. But human sources are fragile. They can be discovered, turned, or manipulated by counterintelligence. They can lie, either out of fear or for personal gain. They can report what they believe to be true without realizing they themselves are being deceived. This is why intelligence agencies layer human reporting with signals intelligence, the interception and analysis of communications. In Venezuela's case, U.S. intelligence likely monitored regime communications through a combination of satellite intercepts, cyber intrusions, and partnerships with regional allies who maintained their own collection capabilities. These intercepts wouldn't necessarily reveal Maduro's exact location. Venezuelan security services are sophisticated enough to use encrypted channels and burner devices, but they reveal patterns of activity. When certain officials communicate at unusual hours, when security convoys are activated, when airspace is suddenly restricted, these are indicators that can be correlated with human reporting. Signals intelligence doesn't confirm. It triangulates. It adds weight to what sources are saying, or it reveals discrepancies that demand further investigation. Financial intelligence also played a role, though its contribution is harder to quantify. Authoritarian leaders rely on networks of patronage and corruption to maintain power. Tracking financial flows, especially movements of regime-linked funds through international banking systems, can reveal operational priorities and even intentions. If payments suddenly flow to a particular security unit, it may indicate heightened protection on a specific individual. If shell companies linked to the regime begin liquidating assets, it could signal preparations for relocation or emergency contingencies. Financial monitoring doesn't tell you where someone is, but it tells you what they're preparing for. And that context can be just as valuable. The CIA's analysts, working alongside Treasury Department specialists, likely build a financial map of Maduro's inner circle, identifying vulnerabilities, dependencies, and leverage points that could be exploited or simply understood as part of the broader intelligence picture. Yet even with multiple streams of intelligence reinforcing each other, the picture remains probabilistic, not certain. Intelligence analysis is not a science of absolutes. It is the disciplined management of uncertainty. Analysts work with confidence levels, competing hypotheses, and the constant possibility that they are being deceived. Maduro's security apparatus understood that foreign intelligence services were targeting him. They employed deception tactics, false schedules, decoy convoys, and deliberate misinformation fed through channels they suspected were compromised. How do you separate loyalty from fear inside a regime? How do you know if a source is reporting truth or repeating a lie designed to mislead you? The CIA's analysts would have cross-referenced every piece of intelligence against established patterns, looking for anomalies that suggested manipulation. They would have run parallel sourcing, seeking confirmation from entirely separate networks to ensure one compromised source couldn't poison the entire operation, and they would have accepted that some percentage of their information was wrong, planning contingencies for intelligence failure even as they moved forward. There were likely near misses, moments when intelligence suggested Maduro would be at a specific location, only for him to change plans at the last moment. There were almost certainly false positives, reports that seemed credible but led nowhere, and there may have been compromised sources, individuals discovered by Venezuelan counterintelligence and either arrested or turned into double agents, feeding the CIA information designed to waste resources and expose operational methods. Each failure added pressure. Each delay increased the risk that the entire network would be rolled up before it could deliver actionable intelligence. The officers running the operation worked under the assumption that time was finite, that eventually someone would make a mistake. that the margin for operational security would collapse. This is the psychological reality of deep cover intelligence work. You are always operating on borrowed time, and you never know when that time will run out. But despite the setbacks and uncertainties, the intelligence picture continued to sharpen. By cross-referencing human reports with signals intercepts, by validating patterns through repeated observation, by eliminating false leads and refining source reliability, the CIA team began to identify windows of vulnerability. They understood which resonances Maduro used most frequently. They identified security gaps in his protective detail, moments when personnel rotations created brief lapses in coverage. They mapped his daily routines down to the times he preferred for meetings, meals, and rest. The intelligence wasn't perfect. It couldn't be, but it was sufficient. Sufficient to brief military planners. Sufficient to construct operational timelines. Sufficient to move from planning to action. The question was no longer whether they had enough intelligence. The question was whether they could act on it before the window closed, before the networks were exposed, before the entire architecture of secrecy collapsed under its own weight. The intelligence picture was complete enough to proceed, but it was also dangerously fragile, held together by sources who could be discovered at any moment and validated by patterns that could shift without warning. The transition from intelligence collection to operational readiness is not a clean boundary. It is a gradual escalation, a series of decisions made in rooms where the consequences of error are measured not in tactical failure but in geopolitical crisis. At some point, the analysts running the Venezuela operation stopped adding to the intelligence picture and started defending it. Their assessments moved from the desks of field stations and fusion centers into the hands of senior officials, who would decide whether the intelligence was sufficient to justify action. This is where intelligence work becomes political, not in the partisan sense, but in the strategic calculus of risk, timing, and consequence. The question was no longer what the CIA knew about Maduro's whereabouts. The question was whether what they knew was enough to stake an operation that could reshape hemispheric relations, trigger internal unrest in Venezuela, or fail catastrophically if the intelligence proved wrong. Intelligence confidence is measured in gradations, not absolutes. Assessments are classified as low, moderate, or high confidence. And even high confidence does not mean certainty. It means the available evidence supports the conclusion more strongly than any alternative hypothesis. But alternative hypotheses still exist. In Maduro's case, the CIA likely delivered an intelligence package rated with high confidence on his general patterns and moderate confidence on his location at any given moment. The distinction matters. High confidence on patterns meant that analysts believed their understanding of Maduro's routines, his security protocols, and his vulnerabilities was accurate based on sustained observation and cross-validated reporting. Moderate confidence on real-time location reflected the reality that even the best intelligence can be outdone by last-minute changes, deception, or simple unpredictability. What happens when intelligence is good enough, but not perfect? Decision-makers must weigh the cost of acting on incomplete information against the cost of waiting for certainty that may never arrive. And they must do so knowing that waiting too long risks exposing sources, losing the operational window, or allowing the target to disappear entirely. The interagency coordination required for an operation of this magnitude unfolds across multiple layers of government, each with its own equities and constraints. The CIA provides intelligence, but does not make policy. The State Department manages diplomatic consequences and legal justifications. The Department of Defense prepares operational assets and command structures. The National Security Council synthesizes inputs and presents options to executive leadership. The Justice Department considers legal frameworks, particularly when operations involve apprehension rather than elimination. Each agency brings its own assessment of risk, its own timelines, and its own threshold for acceptable uncertainty. Intelligence officers may believe the moment to act has arrived, Diplomats may argue that one more week of negotiation could produce a peaceful resolution. Military planners may request additional time for positioning assets or rehearsing contingencies. Legal advisors may insist on clarity around jurisdictional questions and international law. These tensions are not bureaucratic obstacles. They are the mechanisms through which democratic systems, even in classified settings, impose checks on irreversible decisions. The coordination meetings themselves are exercises in managed ambiguity. Intelligence officers present their findings without overselling certainty. They outline what is known, what is assessed with varying confidence, and what remains unknown. They describe sources in generic terms, protecting identities while establishing credibility. They acknowledge the possibility of deception, the risk of source compromise, and the limitations of their collection methods. What they do not do is make the decision to act. That authority rests elsewhere, with officials who must balance intelligence against political imperatives, diplomatic considerations, and the potential for unintended escalation. The role of intelligence in these moments is not to advocate but to inform, to present the operational picture as clearly as possible while leaving room for policymakers to weigh factors that extend beyond the intelligence itself. Yet intelligence officers understand that once their assessments enter the decision-making process, they become part of the justification for whatever follows. Who carries responsibility when intelligence guides irreversible decisions? The question haunts every analyst who has watched their work translate into action. Timing emerged as the most critical variable. Intelligence has a shelf life. The longer an operation waits, the greater the chance that sources are exposed, that targets change behavior, or that external events force a cancellation. In the case of Venezuela, multiple factors compressed the timeline. There were reports that Maduro's security services had begun internal investigations, suggesting they suspected penetration. There were indications that he might relocate to a more secure facility, or even leave the country temporarily, eliminating the operational window entirely. And there was political pressure, both domestic and international, to act decisively or stand down permanently. The intelligence picture would never be perfect. It would only degrade over time. The question was whether the current level of confidence justified moving forward, knowing that hesitation could mean losing the opportunity altogether. Plausible deniability, once a central doctrine of covert operations, has eroded in the modern intelligence environment. Operations involving foreign heads of state cannot be easily concealed or attributed to proxies. If U.S. forces were involved, even indirectly, the operation would be linked to American policy regardless of how carefully it was structured. This reality shaped the coordination process. There was no attempt to hide U.S. involvement, only to ensure that the involvement was legally defensible, strategically justified, and executed in a manner that minimized collateral consequences. Intelligence agencies create conditions, they map vulnerabilities, identify opportunities, and reduce uncertainty, but they do not, in most cases, execute the final action. That responsibility falls to others, to military units, law enforcement agencies, or partner forces whose actions are guided by intelligence but not controlled by it. The CIA's role in the Maduro operation was to make the capture possible, not to carry it out. This distinction is more than procedural. It reflects the division of labor within national security structures, where intelligence informs but does not dictate, and where accountability for outcomes is shared but never evenly distributed. As the final coordination meetings concluded, the sense of inevitability became palpable. Approvals moved up through command structures. Assets were positioned. Communication channels were secured. The intelligence officers who had spent months building the foundation for this moment were largely absent from the final planning. Their work was complete. What remained was execution, and execution belonged to others. But the weight of their contribution lingered. Every source they had recruited, every intercept they had analyzed, every pattern they had validated was now embedded in the operational plan. If the intelligence held, the operation would succeed. If the intelligence proved flawed, the failure would be absolute, and the consequences would reverberate far beyond Venezuela. There were no more collection windows to exploit, no more time to refine assessments, no more opportunities to hedge against uncertainty. The intelligence was as good as it would ever be, and events were already in motion. The architecture of secrecy, built patiently over months in darkness, was about to be tested in the unforgiving light of consequence. When the operation concluded, the public narrative emerged swiftly, shaped by official statements, coordinated leaks, and carefully managed imagery. News agencies reported the capture as a bold enforcement action, justified by international warrants and coordinated with regional partners. Political leaders framed it as accountability for human rights abuses, corruption, and the collapse of democratic norms. The language was precise, legalistic, and designed to preempt challenges to legitimacy. What was absent from these narratives was any acknowledgment of the intelligence foundation that made the operation possible. The CIA was not mentioned in press releases. No intelligence officers appeared at briefings. The agencies that spent months mapping vulnerabilities, cultivating sources, and refining targeting data remained entirely invisible, as they were designed to be. This invisibility is not accidental. It is institutional doctrine. Intelligence agencies succeed when their role is inferred rather than confirmed. When outcomes speak for themselves, an attribution remains ambiguous enough to protect methods, preserve sources, and maintain operational flexibility for future missions. The political shockwaves were immediate and predictable. Governments aligned with Venezuela denounced the operation as an act of aggression, a violation of sovereignty, and a dangerous precedent in international relations. Regional allies expressed support publicly, while navigating complex domestic pressures. Within Venezuela itself, reactions fractured along existing divisions. Some celebrated the capture as liberation, others condemned it as foreign intervention, and still others simply adjusted to the new reality with the pragmatism of populations accustomed to abrupt political shifts. But the geopolitical consequences extended far beyond immediate reactions. The operation signaled to other nations that authoritarian consolidation, even within sovereign borders, does not guarantee immunity from external action when certain thresholds are crossed. It demonstrated that intelligence capabilities, when combined with political will and operational assets, can reach individuals who believe themselves untouchable. And it raised uncomfortable questions about where such operations might lead, what restraints govern them, and whether the precedent established could be invoked again under different circumstances. The diplomatic fallout unfolded over months, not days. Formal complaints were lodged in international forums. Allies sought assurances that similar operations would not be conducted without consultation. Intelligence partnerships were strained by the perception, whether accurate or not, that some agencies had been excluded from operational planning or informed only after the fact. And within the United States, debates emerged about the legal frameworks governing such actions, the balance between executive authority and legislative oversight, and the long-term strategic wisdom of high-profile operations that succeed tactically but complicate broader foreign policy objectives. These debates, conducted largely in classified settings, reflected a tension inherent in intelligence-driven operations. Success is measured in outcomes, but outcomes often create new problems. Who truly owns the outcome of covert intelligence? The agency that provided the information, the officials who authorized the action, the forces that executed it, or the public that inherits the consequences. Responsibility is distributed, language is controlled, and silence becomes the default posture for those who know the most. Much about the operation remains classified, and much may never be confirmed. The identities of sources, the specific methods used for surveillance, the extent of technical penetration into Venezuelan systems, and the internal deliberations that shape decision-making timelines are all protected by classification protocols designed to last decades. Some details will emerge through leaks, memoirs, or declassification processes years from now. Others will remain permanently obscured, either because they touch on capabilities that remain operationally sensitive, or because confirming them would endanger individuals still living in Venezuela or elsewhere. This ambiguity is not a flaw in the intelligence process. It is a feature. Ambiguity protects operational methods. It complicates efforts by adversaries to reverse engineer how they were penetrated, and it allows governments to maintain plausible deniability even when the broad contours of an operation are publicly known. The fact that intelligence played a central role in Maduro's capture is widely understood. The specifics of how that role was executed and who contributed what at each stage will remain a matter of inference and educated speculation rather than confirmed fact. The success looked different when no one claims it. In the conventional understanding of power, success demands visibility. Leaders announce victories, agencies take credit, and narratives are constructed to reinforce legitimacy. But intelligence operates under different rules. Its successes are often invisible, its victories unannounced, and its contributions acknowledged only through implication. The CIA's role in the Maduro operation, if it unfolded as reports suggest, represents a textbook example of intelligence shaping history without claiming authorship. The agency built the conditions for success, delivered the information that made action possible, and then disappeared from the narrative, leaving others to manage the political and diplomatic aftermath. This is the essence of modern covert action: preparation over spectacle, influence over announcement, and effect over attribution. The operation succeeded not because of dramatic intervention, but because of patient, invisible groundwork that created a moment where intervention became feasible. Yet intelligence victories rarely arrive without costs. The sources who provided critical information face uncertain futures. Some may have already been relocated, given new identities, and resettled in countries where Venezuelan security services cannot reach them. Others may still be in place, their cooperation undiscovered, but their risk exposure permanently elevated. The intelligence networks built over months may now be compromised, either fully or partially, limiting future collection capabilities inside Venezuela. And the precedent established by the operation may provoke countermeasures, not just from Venezuela, but from other nations seeking to insulate their leadership from similar actions. Intelligence agencies operate in an environment of constant adaptation, where every success reveals methods, every exposure forces innovation, and every operation shapes the conditions for the next one. The capture of Maduro, regardless of its immediate justifications, will influence how authoritarian governments structure their security, how intelligence agencies plan future operations, and how international norms around sovereignty and intervention continue to evolve. The broader lesson extends beyond Venezuela. In an era where global events are broadcast instantly, dissected endlessly, and debated across every platform, it is easy to assume that what we see represents the full story. But modern geopolitics operates on multiple levels simultaneously. The visible layer, the speeches, the military movements, the official statements, sits atop an invisible architecture of intelligence work that shapes outcomes long before they become public. How many global events are shaped before the public ever notices? How often does intelligence decide history before leaders even speak? The answers remain elusive, deliberately so, but the pattern is consistent. Intelligence agencies do not announce themselves. They prepare conditions, reduce uncertainty, and create moments where action becomes possible. Then they step back, allowing others to occupy the visible space while the architecture of secrecy dissolves back into darkness, ready to be rebuilt for the next operation, the next target, the next moment when invisible power reshapes visible reality. If this breakdown challenged your understanding of how intelligence shapes global events, share your analysis in the comments. What do you think remains hidden about this operation? What other historical moments might have been shaped by intelligence work we never see? Subscribe for more deep intelligence analysis that goes beyond headlines and into the invisible structures of modern power. And if you're ready to understand how the world really works, not how it's presented, keep watching. Because in the world of intelligence, the most important stories are the ones no one tells you to look for. The capture of Venezuela's president will be remembered as a defining moment in hemispheric relations. But for those who understand how intelligence operates, it will be remembered as something else entirely. A case study in patient preparation, invisible influence, and the quiet architecture of power that shapes history from the shadows, one operation at a time. Without ever stepping into the light,